Hi, my name is Vincent Encomio. I'm the Florida Sea Grant Extension Agent for Martin and St. Lucie counties, and I'd like to talk to you about one of my favorite seafoods, oysters. Right here. And today I'm going to cover oysters on the half shell and a very simple but classic mignonette sauce. It's perfect for raw oysters. So just to tell you a little bit about myself and oysters, I've been studying oysters for quite some time. I've enjoyed doing research on them. I love doing restoration work on them. That's something I've been heavily involved in the last several years. I love educating people about oysters, but more than anything, I love to eat oysters. So I'm gonna hope, and I hope that you will too after seeing this video. And I'm gonna go through how to shuck an oyster and make a nice little mignonette sauce. So this is the eastern oyster. It's our common oyster that's found along the eastern seaboard of North America. They're found all the way from Canada throughout the Gulf of Mexico, and form a very important fishery within North America, as oysters are important throughout the world as a food item. They are known as a bivalve mollusk. Bivalve meaning they have two shells. The top shell here, or the right valve, and the bottom shell, or the left valve. And in North America, the eastern oyster forms extensive reefs. And that makes it a very important species ecologically. They are a keystone species upon which many other species depend. They form extensive reefs. They're actually the most dominant reef-forming organism in temperate waters. When you get in the tropics, then it's the corals. They can filter the water. An adult oyster can filter about from 20 to 50 gallons of water per day. They estimate in the 1600s that when John Smith sailed into the Chesapeake Bay, the oyster populations there were so numerous they could filter the entire volume of the bay in less than a week. But now it takes much longer than that. Oyster populations, not just here in North America, but throughout the world, are very imperiled. They're a fraction of what they once were. But the good news about that is many people across the world are working very hard to restore oyster populations, not just for the fishery importance, and they are very important as a fishery, but also for the ecological benefits they provide the environment and ultimately us as well. So first thing I want to cover is how to shuck an oyster. As we are all stuck at home, and if you want to eat oysters, you can't go to your favorite raw bar, you can't go to your favorite restaurant, got to learn how to shuck an oyster. So first things first, safety first. So I always recommend using a sturdy glove. This is actually a cut-proof glove that's used in kitchens. Any work glove would do, any sturdy work glove would work. You can also use a towel to hold the oyster. That's another technique that's quite commonly used to protect yourself. But most important thing, always practice safe shucking. Wear a glove. Use protection. So I'm going to start with this oyster here. One thing I wanted to point out is that I've got two different kinds of oysters. They're both the eastern oyster, but one oyster is, these are wild caught oysters. These are these are fish from the Gulf of Mexico. And these are farmed oysters from, these are actually on the east coast, on the Atlantic coast of Florida. Both of these are from Florida, one from the Gulf and wild, one from the Atlantic and farmed. So the first thing you're going to notice is the difference in size. The wild oysters are much bigger. Those have been in the water a lot longer. The shells are a lot rougher in appearance. That also indicates they've been on the bottom a lot longer, and they're more reflective of a natural oyster reef or oyster bed. While farmed oysters are typically grown in suspended cages, and in Florida they grow them in floating cages. That keeps them up in the water column, and so they can grow pretty fast. These are actually much younger, which is the reason why they're smaller. Even though these are grown very differently, they both taste great. So I'm going to shuck the wild oyster first. So as I mentioned, there's two shells, which is why they're called bivalves. You've got the top shell and the bottom shell, or the cup. This is a standard, typical oyster knife. This is one of my favorite types of oyster knives. This is a New Haven style oyster knife. And one thing that's unique about the New Haven style oyster knife is that curved end, that curved tip. And I'll show you what that's used for in just a second. But the first thing you want to do to open an oyster, you take that knife. Right here is the hinge. And there's a ligament there that connects these two shells together. And that's what you want to break. So you take your knife, got that curved side up, insert that into the hinge area. You kind of work it back and forth like turning a key. And what you're going to try to do is you'll pop that ligament so that that shell can break. Those two shells can separate. So there you go. I don't know if you heard that, but I pop that ligament. Then I flip it over to where the curved side is down. And what that allows me to do is I can now scrape the knife along the bottom of that top shell. And what I'm doing here is cutting the adductor muscle, or the main muscle that keeps the two shells apart. And there you go. Nice clean shuck. All right. Okay. And then flip the knife back over this way and run it along the bottom to cut the muscle on the bottom. And there you go. Nice shucked raw half-shell oyster. All right. Okay. So now I'll shuck the farmed oyster. Also occasionally wipe the blade off on your glove or a towel just to keep that grit from getting into the meat of the oyster. So again, insert the knife right at the hinge. You want to twist that. Oops. Sometimes they're a little tricky. There we go. You need to pop that ligament. Try to keep the oyster as level as possible, because what you don't want to happen is you don't want to lose the liquid that's inside the shell, or the liquor, because that's a lot of flavor right there. Oops. There we go. Again, cut the muscle on the bottom. There we go. Beautiful little oyster. All right. Okay. So the next thing I'm going to do is make the sauce. It's pretty easy. All it is about a 1/4 cup of vinegar. Your favorite vinegar, you can use any kind of vinegar you want. In this case, I'm using a champagne vinegar. All right. Okay. Goes in here. A tablespoon or so of shallots. These are minced shallots. Mix that up. Add some lemon to that. Usually do it to taste. Okay. And then black pepper. It's coarsely ground. Again, to taste. I like to put a lot of pepper in there. It's a nice contrast with the vinegar. All right. Just mix that up. There you go. That's your classic mignonette sauce for raw oysters. It's great. You don't need a lot, but it really adds a lot to the oyster. So the other thing I like to do, squeeze some lemon on that oyster. Just a little bit of that sauce. There we go. Oh, Fantastic. So one thing, always too, I mentioned restoration programs throughout the country. A lot of those restoration programs utilize old oyster shell to create new reefs. So that's something that you can get behind too in your area. If they have oysters, they probably, hopefully, have a shell recycling program in your area. Give those shells back to that program. They'll use those shells to restore oysters in your local area. All right. So oysters are, aside from tasting fantastic, they're a great food. They're really good for your health. They are incredibly high in zinc. Basically the highest food, the highest zinc content of any food. So, and zinc is really important. It's been shown to help modulate the immune response, which improves our response to infection. The other aspect of other nutritional benefits is they're very high in vitamin B12, about 3 times the daily recommended allowance for vitamin B12. High in omega-3 fatty acids. So a dash of lemon juice on an oyster, zinc plus vitamin C, it's the perfect natural immune booster. All right. And the nice thing about oysters is you can always feel good about eating oysters, especially farmed oysters. Farmed oysters are typically known as one of the most sustainable seafoods out there. They are feeding on natural food, all oysters, and they're feeding natural food on phytoplankton and algae out in the environment. So very little impact to the surrounding waters that they're being grown in. All right. So the one thing I also want to talk about too is where to get your oysters in Florida and when. So it's typically the traditional months to eat oysters are in the R months, your fall, winter, early spring, November, December, January, for example. And it's typically thought that in the non-R months, it is not safe to eat oysters. It is, you can eat oysters, raw oysters, all year round. And one of the reasons why, what makes that safe is that oysters, the waters where oysters are grown, they are regularly monitored for water quality to make sure that they're safe, that your shellfish is safe to eat. And the original reason for closing harvest or limiting harvest during the summer months is really not for health reasons, but mainly to protect the fishery so that they cannot be impacted when they're reproducing, which is typically the warmer summer months. And even though oysters, when in the summer, they do spawn, so they can get thinner and more watery during the summer. A lot of the farm oysters that are the farms that are growing all over Florida now, a lot of those oysters are triploid oysters. They don't reproduce, so they're devoting all their energy into growth, resulting in a meatier oyster throughout those summer months. So that's still a good product. That being said, in warmer months, you can have a higher risk of bad water, less good water quality. So you always want to make sure that you're buying oysters from areas where they're approved areas. Always look at the shellfish tag to see when and where your oysters were harvested. But you can eat oysters all year round. And eating raw oysters does pose a risk for people that are immunocompromised, might have chronic liver or bloodborne diseases. So in those cases, I recommend that you cook your oysters and don't eat them raw. But cook, maybe a future recipe that we can have is for some cooked oysters. All right. And as far as getting oysters, these oysters I had delivered straight to my door from all the way across the Gulf of Mexico and a couple hours away from the Indian River Lagoon. Within days of harvest, they were at my front door. So you can get fresh shellfish right now, and it's a great product, and it's a great way to support our seafood industry and our oystermen and oyster women that are now growing oysters throughout the state. So in closing, I hope that you enjoy this little recipe. I hope that you like oysters as much as I do. And stay tuned for more seafood recipes at Florida Seafood at your fingertips. All right.